Welcome to Saints and Sources. My name is John Brown. Today we're going to be talking about the biblical justifications or reasonings behind modern Mormon polygamy. The first two, or the big two that is frequently talked about, is that it's a command to people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which we're going to dive into today. Um, the other one is that polygamy is used as a tool by God to raise up a righteous generation. And these are two things that we wanted to examine today and see what do we know for sure, and what might be more of a tradition that has been passed down to us, but that we can learn from and maybe get more light and knowledge through study and prayer, which is always our goal, right? It's important to remember that my content here is to explore the historical and scriptural evidences and to see what we know and might be traditions. With that said, this content is specifically for people who believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, the restoration of the priesthood from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young, all the way to our prophets today. And especially for people that polygamy is one of the teachings or beliefs that's on their shelf of kind of confusing or troubling or hard to reconcile items for their faith. Today, we carefully examine the history, traditions, and teachings that were with the goal of learning and growing from the people that come before us, but absolutely not to criticize or condemn these people or leaders for their choices. So, specifically about the Abrahamic covenant or the new and everlasting covenant, early church leaders or early members of the church understood that polygamy was an integral part that could not be removed. In fact, it was a commandment and part of God to Abraham and part of the Abrahamic covenant. And that leads us to our question today. Was polygamy commanded by God to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob? We're specifically going to be reading in Genesis, though other readings like the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, as well as the Book of Abraham, are also going to be talked about. So let's dive right in. Genesis 16, Abraham is known as Abram, and his wife Sarai are they have a conundrum. Sarai is not been able to have children. So in Genesis 16, Sarai specifically says that she'll give her bondwoman Hagar so that Sarai can have children by her. It's explicit in the text that these children would not be considered Hagar's children, but they'd be considered Sarai's children. So using a bondwoman, or for what we would call a surrogate, which is a woman who can carry and give birth to a baby for another individual couple. One important question is, what is exactly the relationship between Hagar and Abraham? In one of the scriptures, it refers to her as a wife, but most of the scriptures in the Old Testament refer to her as either a servant or a bondwoman. Or bondwoman is essentially a slave. In verse 2, it says, "And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened unto the voice of Sarai." This pregnancy, again, was intended for Sarai's child to be born by Hagar, and there's no mention of God commanding this to happen. 3, it goes on to say, "And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife." But as we go on, it's pretty clear that Hagar is not being treated as a wife or even as a concubine. So in verse 5, it says, "And Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I, Sarai, was despised in Hagar's eyes, in Hagar's or her eyes. The Lord judged between me and thee. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Go, do to her as it pleaseth thee." And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she, Hagar, fled from her face. So in this relationship, it's pretty clear that Abram is not considerate or concerned about Hagar's well-being, emotional happiness, or anything like that. Essentially, Sarai is upset with Hagar for looking down on her, essentially because at that time women's worth was strongly and directly tied to their ability to have children, um, that Sarai felt kind of put out and took it out on her physically to the point where Hagar ran away. So um, in Genesis 16, it goes on to talk about an angel speaking with Hagar. And this is the closest thing we can get to an actual like possible commandment from God to Hagar, um, establishing that connection, that this polygamous relationship was commanded by God. But I think a careful reading of the text shows that that's not the case. Um, it goes to say, and he, the angel, said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, not Abram's wife, whence comest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai, not from my husband. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, not return to Abraham or your husband, and submit thyself to her hands, not his hands. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, and it shall not be numbered for multitude. So again, I think a careful reading of this text shows that there's no commandment from God to Abram to have this polygamous relationship. This is very much a cultural solution to the problem of infertility. In chapter 17, it goes on to say nothing specifically of note here, but it's more what it doesn't say, that the covenant of Abraham gets established, everyone gets a name change except for Hagar, but there's no additional children born. There's no more, he went unto her. Um, this child was specifically born to be Sarai's child by proxy, and no additional children were conceived. In chapter 21, it gets to the breaking point. Um, Isaac is born, and the need for this bondwoman's child is no longer there. In verse 9, it says, And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Therefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman, not cast out this concubine, not cast out this wife, but cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be the heir with my son, even with Isaac. Now, Abraham is specifically sorrowful about this because he, I'm sure, has some type of affection for Isaac, but without any second uh, thought, Abram does feel comforted, has a revelation that everything's going to work out for them, but he essentially banishes her, leaves her with little support, some water in the desert. In fact, it is so certain to Hagar that things are desperate that she fully expects to watch her son Isaac die, or sorry, her son Ishmael die, and she places him under a tree and walks a far way off so that she doesn't have to watch him die. And it is only there that another miraculous angel visitation comes and they're saved. Uh, but this whole journey with Hagar, at no point in time is this a relationship that you would consider a celestial relationship in any way, shape, or form. There is no um, love or affection or consideration for Hagar's feeling in any way, shape, or form. In chapter 25, it specifically says Sarah dies, and Abraham remarries a woman named Keturah, and she has 6 sons. I think this is important in the timeline to show that if if Abraham really believed in polygamy, or especially if he believed that polygamy was a commandment, he could have easily taken a second wife before or after Hagar gets banished, and he could have additional. He was a pretty wealthy man. He could have had additional sons, but he waited until Sarah dies. He gets remarried, but even then, these 6 sons. So he has 8 sons in total. These 6 sons and Ishmael get no part of the covenant, no part of the priesthood, no part of the promised blessings, and they're essentially before his death, they're kind of sent their own way, and everything, the covenant of Abraham and everything goes to Isaac. So again, this is not really concerned with population at this point. It specifically is going to Sarah's only biological child. All right, so the next patriarch we're going to talk about is Isaac. Now, Isaac has a wonderful love story with Rebekah, but no polygamous relationships are mentioned. Not in Genesis, not in the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, not in the Book of Abraham. Joseph Smith had ample time to kind of flesh out that doctrine, and this was not done. It's not until D&C section 132 where it says that polygamy is a commandment, it is a requirement, and Isaac also practices. I think this is something to consider, because if this was truly a commandment, Abraham was a righteous person and would have taught his covenant keeping son this, and it did not last. This kind of multiple wives and concubines did not last one generation. Isaac, to the best of our knowledge, has a completely monogamous relationship and has two sons, Esau, which we're not really going to talk about, and Jacob. Now, Jacob is definitely, of these three patriarchs, the one who truly does practice polygamy. He has two wives and he has two concubines. But the big question is, are these wives a commandment from God, or is it a reality of a cultural situation? As we read in Genesis 29 and 30, it's pretty clear that this was never commanded by God, that he develops a relationship with Rachel and he loves Rachel, but he works for her for 7 years. But on the wedding night, Laban, the father-in-law, does a trick without telling him and switches them. And so we come in at verse 25, and it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said, and Jacob says to Laban, what is this that thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? So this is not a decision he makes by choice. He already loves this woman. He's already dedicated to Rachel, but because of being beguiled, he is married to another woman. Now, with their understanding at the time, a polygamous relationship is not a sin. It's not something that they're aware of is completely commanded against. And so Jacob works another 7 years and gets married to the woman that he loves. In fact, it says in verse 30, and he went also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served him yet another 7 years. And I did want to go off on a small tangent here, that this is really heartbreaking for pretty much everyone involved. Rachel loves this man. This man loves Rachel, and she's in this relationship where we'll read later that she has to share this husband with her sister, but because she is infertile, um, her self-worth is so low that she says that she would rather die than not have any children. Um, and I think it's really important that we as members of the church really, there's so many general conference talks and everything that talk about the importance of women as children of God. Women are not appendages, they're not side characters to the lives of men, but they are their own individual people with their individual destiny and their individual uh, um, faith and everything. They have a beautiful life, and they should not be simplified to childbearing units, right? This is not a relationship that you would want for your daughter. This is not a relationship you would want for your sister or for your mother. Um, Rachel obviously has to live a pretty difficult life in that way. Leah also is kind of a victim in this situation where she is doing everything that she knows to be right. She is giving everything she can to her husband. She's providing children. But no matter what she does, she doesn't. I'm kind of editorializing a little bit and putting my own spin in this. She clearly does not feel enough. She feels like no matter what she does, that love that she wants from her husband is never going to be there because it is with her sister, which has got to be heartbreaking. So in the scriptures, Rachel, in severe depression, goes and gives one of her bondwomen to have seed for her. And this is hard for her. I'm going to, Bilhah and Zilpah, I believe it's Bilhah, correct me if I'm wrong, gives her Bilhah, and Bilhah doesn't even get to name her own children. these are not her children, they are her master's children or mistress's children. And in an attempt to not be one-upped, Leah, who already has 6 sons and a daughter, also gives her bondwoman, and they have 2 sons. The last kind of a person suffering from this relationship has got to be Jacob, right? Jacob clearly had a loving relationship with Rachel, and that is what he wanted. I'm sure he wanted to emulate the loving relationship that his father Isaac and Rebekah had, but because of this situation, he's got responsibility and affection for these 2 women, um, and this strife, this interpersonal strife, is causing all kinds of problems. And I would argue that this animosity between the brothers is directly reflected in the story that we see, that they try to kill and eventually enslave um, um, Joseph, um, and that whole story. So going through the story here, it is pretty clear that there's no commandment. Abraham um, ha, was never commanded by God to practice polygamy. Isaac never practiced polygamy at all, and Jacob was beguiled and tricked into having this polygamous relationship. Now, I do want to stop here. Although I think um, we see elsewhere in scriptures, especially the New Testament and the Book of Mormon, that polygamy is commanded against and called an abomination. I think it's fair to ask a question. Um, is this because did they not get this revelation because of a lack of spirituality or sensitivity? And I would say no. Uh, um, for something to be a sin, there needs to be knowledge that it's wrong. And the scriptures, and we'll talk about this later, but the scriptures are very clear that revelation does not just come because of righteousness, but also because of readiness. If a person or a culture are not ready to take that next step, that line upon line, that precept on precept, that slow learning, I would say loving, kind, forgiving way that God teaches us, um, that then that revelation won't come. And there's a similar thing with, I would say, slavery at the time, where slavery obviously is a bad thing. And if we it would be unfair to say if only Jacob or Moses had been more righteous, then they would have commanded slavery against slavery, and then thousands of years of suffering would have been avoided. Again, we'll talk about this more later, but it's important to remember that these were righteous men that God was clearly working with, but that does not mean every decision they made was celestially complete or completely had a complete knowledge. Now, you might be saying, John, you've talked about a lot of scriptures here, but you haven't discussed D&C section 132, which we're really going to dig into later. Right now I'm specifically talking about ancient scriptures, separate from the Doctrine and Covenants, but also Jacob 2. Uh, right now, there's a current understanding that Jacob 2 has this polygamy exception. But this is discussed in greater detail. There's 2 videos that I will link here. One is by Gwendolyn Wine, a researcher, and the other is by Karen Hyatt, who really delve into this more deeply. But I do want to give kind of a Reader's Digest version of what a monogamy affirming person's interpretation of the scripture. That the entire chapter is commanding monogamy, chastity, and talking about how the hearts of the daughters of God are being broken by this decision to practice polygamy, right? So as we get to D&C or to Jacob 2 verse 30, I think it's important to read that in context. So 29, 30, and 31. And it's also important to remember that whenever the term "these things" are used in this area, it is referring to um, a justification that an abomination or a sin is okay. So when it refers to these things, it is specifically referring to something that should not be done. And I think a more accurate reading of Jacob 2, 29, 30, and 31 would be, "Wherefore this people shall keep my commandments, or cursed be the land for their sakes. For if I will raise up seed unto me, I will command my people," the monogamy and chastity that was just barely commanded, "otherwise they will hearken unto these things which ye ought not have done," seen elsewhere in the chapter. For behold, I, the Lord, have seen the sorrow and heard the mournings of the daughters of my people in the land of Jerusalem, yea, and in all the lands of my people, because of the wickedness and abomination of their husbands. So I don't think it's saying, don't ever do this unless there's a caveat here in 2,000 years. But it's being very clear. We have been taught that the decisions of David and Solomon to have many wives and concubines is a great abomination. And that is in stark contrast and completely contradicts D&C's 132, where it says David and Solomon's having many wives and concubines was totally fine. So this brings us to our modern day. There's 4 quotes from Brigham Young that I really want to focus on that kind of stresses not only that was their understanding at that time that polygamy was an integral part and a specific explicit commandment from God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that this was an eternal principle that all men needed to practice. The 4 quotes that we're going to use today is going to be, the only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those that enter into polygamy. Brigham Young, 1866. He also says, the law of plural marriage is one of the most important doctrines ever revealed to man, and without it cannot attain the fullness of exaltation in the eternal world. Right? He's not mincing words here. He goes later to say, some quietly wish that plural marriage was not here, but it is the will of the Lord, and it is the new and everlasting covenant, and it will remain forever. That's Brigham Young, 1867. And lastly, his quote, we believe in the law of many wives and concubines, and I tell you, for I know it, it will sail over and ride triumphantly above all the prejudices and priestcrafts of the day. It will be fostered and believed in by the more intelligent portion of the world as one of the best doctrines ever proclaimed to any people. This was in 1859. So not only is that no longer what we believe, but he's making claims and predictions that ultimately polygamy was not able to be practiced by all believing members. Eventually, it was stopped. Now, people might say we're still doing it, but it's polygamy after death, and I would say that's kind of apples and oranges. And I'd be happy to have that discussion some other time. But specifically, he said that this is one of the best. And he says in a lot of places that polygamy is one of the most important, most vital, most beautiful, most wonderful teachings that eventually the whole world will accept. Not only is that not true, it's even hard for us today. Polygamy is one of the few doctrines that is taught, especially the new doctrines restored to Joseph and Brigham Young and everything, that causes a lot of confusion and disgust and revulsion. We don't get that from the kingdoms of glory or temple work or eternal families or baptisms for the dead or any of those things, right? And I think it's fair to ask if that is, or why that is. In fact, even people that staunchly believe that polygamy was a commandment, I've seen a lot of interviews from Jacob Hansen from Thoughtful Faith, Greg Madsen from Quick Media, or my kind of friend Christopher Blythe. Christopher, they say polygamy is horrible. I wish I never heard about it. I don't like it. I don't want it to come back. All these statements. Christopher Blythe specifically tells a story where he's talking with his wife, and his wife says, if polygamy is required for us to go to the celestial kingdom, then we're just not going to, we're going to figure something else out. And I think that's really telling, that this is something on our shelf that faithful, wonderful, intelligent people see, that if I have the option between that heaven can't be heaven, the celestial kingdom, the presence of God, exaltation, and all the things, wonderful things that we talk about, eternal families, if that requires polygamy, that I physically cannot do it. That is something that I don't think is unique to those people. I think that is something that we can faithfully ask our questions. Is this a tradition that we can understand more deeply with more revelation? Not to take it upon ourselves, but to ask God, to ask leaders of the church, is there something we're missing? Is there more information? Is there more light and knowledge we can have? And that's really what the goal of this whole channel is. Not to put ourselves in the foot of the prophet, but to ask ourselves legitimately, is there more that we can know? Or am I righteous enough, and am I prepared enough to receive that revelation, even if it's something that is hard to take? Like I said before, that was the current understanding. Then, between 1840 and 1860, the writings of Joseph Fielding Smith, Bruce R. McConkie, and others began to describe polygamy as a special commandment. In fact, McConkie's Book Mormon Doctrine called plural marriage a special law given at times, but not part of the new and everlasting covenant, which is a complete reversal of the first 50 years of the church, or 1850 to 1900-ish. Since 1960, it's progressed even more. Modern LDS leaders explicitly teach that monogamy is the standard of God, and that plural marriage is only practiced when God specifically commands. Current teachings in the Gospel Topics essay for plural marriage in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, published in 2014, say that plural marriage was commanded only for a time, and it does not tie directly to the covenant of Abraham, and emphasizes today that the Lord's standard is monogamy. So I think it's fair to say, like, what are the reasoning? Why is this teaching? Why is this doctrine shifted so much? The last question that I want to entertain is, some people will ask, what's the point? Why are you so interested? Polygamy was 100 years ago, 200 years ago, thousands of years ago. It's so uncomfortable. Why can't you just let it be in the past and we can move forward? And the reason for me that this is such an important thing, one is, if something is true, we should hold to it, whether it's difficult to accept or not. Regardless of what the answer is, we should hold to that. I believe the truth claims of the gospel of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints stand independent of that. But secondly, I think when we understand revelation, prophets, priesthood better, it gives us this growth-centered, forward-looking view that's very in line with the atonement, right? That righteousness is not a static state. That if a person is righteous but does not grow, then they cannot continue in that righteousness. And I think that's the same for the church. It's going to grow line upon line, precept upon precept, every generation. So I think there's this tradition, and I would call it a false tradition, or maybe an immature understanding that kind of puts the responsibility of what is righteousness, what is revelation, solely on the prophet. And I think there's reasons for that, but I'm going to simplify it in kind of a four-step process. Number one is the misunderstanding, or it sets up that God wants his followers to make righteous decisions. True and easy to understand. That the next logical step is, we are followers of God as members of his church, and we desire righteousness. So check. Three, if God revealed a commandment, and this is where it gets a little dicey, if God revealed a commandment, we as a church would find, even if we found it extremely difficult to live, we would quickly rise to overcome our doubts and our fears through faith. And that's always the goal. And I think for a vast majority of the time, that is the case. But the misunderstanding is this inherently and automatically the condition? Which leads us to the last logical, the real logical misstep. So, because blank has not been revealed, then what I am doing now must be a complete understanding and righteous, right? And that's kind of the problem. I discussed earlier that sometimes atheists, when I was in high school, they would say a proof that God isn't real or that prophets aren't real is that, like Moses, if the law of Moses allowed for slavery, and that if God were real, God would know that slavery is horrible, and he would say, "Hey, Moses, no slavery," and then Moses would say, "Hey, children of Israel, no slavery," and then thousands of years of suffering could be avoided, right? And you can insert that into a lot of different situations. The issue is, that's not a line upon line precept. That's just an assumption that no matter what God says, that everyone's going to be able to skip several levels and get to that point. Because specifically in Moses' example, in the story of getting the law of Moses and the Ten Commandments, that he goes up to the mount. He's learning from God. He's gone for a while. And this is no judgment to the children of Israel. In their immaturity and in their fear, they turn to what they know and what they are familiar with, which is idol worship, right? I don't think this is because they were bad, but this is just the stage of their spiritual development. Moses comes down, he sees, oh my gosh, they're worshiping cows, golden calves, and all this stuff. And in frustration or disappointment or whatever emotion he was having, he throws down the tablets and breaks them, calls them to repentance, and then goes back up for another 40 days and develops a new law of Moses that these people are more able to reach. Again, we're not criticizing these people. That's just where they were. You don't make fun of a third grader for being at a third grade reading level, right? But you would get upset at a senior for staying at a third grade level. That labored analogy. One that we specifically, it's a little more controversial, so I hope you guys stay with me on this. Um, Early church leaders taught that it was a spiritual, mental, or some other type of defect that kept members of African ancestry from holding the priesthood, going to the temple, getting sealed, um, and that essentially the understanding they had at the time was that these African members, their faith and everything needed to rise. They needed to grow. There needed to be some type of repentance process for the sins of their ancestors or something like that. And that was as much as they understood at the time. And again, no judgment. But it's pretty clear from Gospel Topics essays today and how we understand it that that I would say that it was not the limitations of the African saints or the ancestors, the saints with African ancestry, but it's more likely that the world and the members of the church were not ready to be in a church that was led, that had a black bishop, that had an elders quorum president, that had um, temple workers that were black. And to be honest, it'd be unfair to expect these people to be 100 or 200 years ahead of their time. It was difficult for members of the church to accept in 1978 when the revelation. So it had nothing to do with their righteousness. These early our early pioneer ancestors were wonderfully righteous, but they were not ready, right? And I think that's a wonderful thing because instead of putting the responsibility on the prophet, you get ready, you tell me, and then I'll show up. Instead, it's me. What can I do? What can I do to build Zion? What can I do to learn and to grow and to invite revelation and to help people? And not to do the minimum, but to take that next step that God wants me to take. And this is a process that can be frustrating, but it's a wonderful, it's full of grace and forgiveness. And we should offer grace to the generation behind us, just like our children, hopefully, will look gracefully on our ignorance or shortcomings, right? So, after all of the things we talked about, all the scriptures that we've reviewed, um, the last and final question is I want us to consider faithfully and honestly if the scriptures describe God commanding Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to marry polygamously in the covenant of Abraham. Or do the scriptures actually describe God inspiring righteous patriarchs whose time and culture were not yet ready for change, and their understanding of many wives and concubines was not ready to change? And maybe we have been taught this tradition in a well-meaning way by good and righteous people, and we can be ready for more light and knowledge. Well, thank you so much. If you found this content edifying and enlightening and hopeful, I hope that you give us a like. If you have any questions, I'd love to interact with you guys in the comments. But subscribe and sharing it with people who has polygamy on their shelf. I hope that this is a resource for those people. It took me a long time of wrestling with this and patience from my wife to get where I am, and I hope that that struggle can help people along. That for so long I was so afraid of considering these questions because of the assumption that if I considered them, then it meant that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints couldn't be true, or that Brigham Young was this malevolent, evil person. And it's just not true. Um, my faith and testimony of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and everything has never been stronger. And I hope this helps you. Take care, and if you have time, come see me in the next video about if polygamy raises a righteous generation. Take care.